Hello and welcome to the Tech for Good podcast. I'm Romilly Broad and we're here as always to meet the people striving to make the world a better place, working in and around technology. One of those people is today's guest, Mary Jacques. She's Executive Director for Global ESG and Regulatory Compliance at Lenovo. It's a global technology powerhouse. I think around 75,000, maybe even more employees now, operating in just about every country in the world. Supply chains as complex as any, headquartered in an interesting arrangement, split between North Carolina in the States and China. And Mary Jacques is in charge of making sure that Lenovo as a company focuses squarely on doing the right things and doing good as part of all of that, and certainly achieving some fairly ambitious objectives. Welcome to the podcast, Mary, and thanks for taking time out from whatever you're doing at the moment. First of all, rather than me trying to explain who you are and what you do, maybe you could let us know yourself. What is your actual role and what does that involve for you on a day-to-day basis?
Well, I'm delighted to be here, and I always like talking about ESG and what Lenovo is doing, to your point, to try to do the right thing. So currently, I am the Executive Director of Lenovo's Global ESG, which is Environmental, Social, and Governance and Regulatory Compliance organization. And so I have the great privilege of working with a large team of experts across the ESG field. So primarily focused on environmental within my team specifically. So we do things like drive Lenovo's corporate climate change strategy, our water resiliency policies and programs. We work very closely with our supply chain organization to drive a lot of the programs that we have into the supply chain and work collaboratively with our suppliers to try to make progress together. In addition to that, I also work with the team that publishes our annual ESG report. So it's a really comprehensive overview of what Lenovo is doing across the board around the world in all areas of environmental, social, and governance that we hope are material to our company and our stakeholders. And I'm leaving a lot of people out, but we also manage some of our programs that help drive progress across the business. So some of the management systems that we have around energy and climate or environmental management, our net zero business management system, and a lot of other areas. I also serve as the Vice President of the Lenovo Foundation Board of Directors. So I get to work, well, not necessarily on a day-to-day basis, but I get to work on some of the social issues that Lenovo is driving as a company. And that's been really exciting. I've been in that role for less than a year, but working with the teams around the world that are driving both our giving, whether it's dollars or equipment, but also our employee engagement and volunteerism. And we have a great team that's working on that, that's based broadly in a number of different parts of the world. So that's been really fun too.
Wow, and I happen to have spent a bit of time looking at Lenovo's latest ESG report, and it's extensive, I think it's fair to say. And I also think I heard somewhere that Lenovo's actually been doing that for quite a long time, and possibly it was a fairly early starter when it came to this. 15 years or so it's been doing its best to be transparent about these goals, I suppose. Where do you think Lenovo is at? If you were going to be honest and say, look, these, and I think this year more than most, from an environmental perspective, we've seen the effects of encroaching climate change. We know that this is becoming more and more urgent. Lenovo is putting huge amounts of effort into that. There's 140 plus pages of report that you can go and find out more about it. But what's your assessment in terms of how well Lenovo is doing?
So I think to your point, we've been doing this a long time. So it's not something that's new to us. We've had various ESG programs in place for over 15 years, and we've actually had them in place to the point where we can measure and report our progress. I think this was our 17th annual ESG report. So on the one hand, I can say that I think we're seasoned. We have a lot of experience in driving these programs, but the journey continues to evolve. And so the challenges and the breadth and depth of the challenges continues to expand. And so, if I'm perfectly honest with myself, I think we have a really solid foundation and some experience to build on, but the landscape is constantly changing. And so, I think about things like the fact that we were a signatory to the UN Global Compact, which essentially expresses our commitment to the UN SDGs in the early 2000s. So at some point before 2010, we signed on to the UN Global Compact. And we've been making good progress towards our commitments under that. But this year, we just signed on to the new Forward Faster campaign that sort of renews our commitment to specific aspects of the UN Global Compact and the SDGs. And so I think that's sort of analogous to where we are too. We've got some experience, but we need to, constantly reinvigorate and refocus and assess where we are and what our priorities are, and really work to make decisions today that may not be that, we may not see the end in sight, but we need to be making decisions today along that path towards our ultimate goals that are helping us get there. So we're not a beginner, but I think that the path is really long. And so we certainly recognize that we by no means have everything figured out. And it's something that we constantly have to assess and sort of reevaluate what our priorities are and where we're best suited to address some of these challenges.
Yeah, and Lenovo as a I guess at an advanced stage in its journey in this regard has a role to play as something of a flag bearer, if you like, and an influencer for global change. But just to come back to that report, I think one of the key messages this year was a statement or a restatement towards Lenovo's ambition to be net zero in a measurable way, as in as measured against standards that Lenovo is not just setting for itself by 2050. Presumably that's kind of complicated for an organization as large and as industrially complex as Lenovo. Would that be fair to say?
Yes. Yeah, definitely. So that's a great example too. Back to your original question about where we are in the maturity curve. So we've had climate targets in place for over a decade. We met our first generation of goals in 2020. We actually met them early. But one of the things that we started working on in 2017, and then we constantly have had to reevaluate, is our climate change targets. And so I think what you were referring to was that last year in our ESG report, we announced that we were aligned to the Science Based Targets Initiative's net zero standards. And so you've already highlighted this, but a number of reasons why this is so important is that we are setting targets that address our full scope of climate emissions. So when we say we have climate targets, we're not just talking about our own emissions that are related to our factories or our research and development facilities, but we're really considering our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, which cover our value chain. And that's significant for us because our own emissions, our scope 1 and 2, are less than 1% of our overall emissions. Our value chain emissions are by far our biggest category, over 99%. And so we've set targets to address those key areas, including the use of our products when we sell them and our customers are using them around the world. We sell a lot of PCs, we sell a lot of servers and phones, and those have an impact. So we're setting targets to address those emissions, the emissions of our supply chain. So all of the parts and materials that we buy and move around the world to make products, those emissions are ours and we have to account for it. And then, of course, the movement of those products and parts, the global logistics emissions, those are the 3 biggest categories: the use of sold products, the purchased goods and services, and then the transportation. And so why I think our commitment is so important is that we are aligned to the Science Based Targets Initiative's new net zero standard. And that standard is really important because it tells organizations how to set goals that are aligned with science. And so there's been a lot of really ambitious commitments that have been made recently, and many of them are really meaningful. But without the backing of a standard or the science, it's really hard to compare and make sure that we're all on the same path. And so that's why having something like the SBTi's net zero standard is hugely important. And I'll be honest with you, it is not an easy process to set really meaningful goals that are aligned to the SBTI. It took us several years to go through the process. And you have to have, it's not something that you can enter into lightly. You have to have a huge amount of data to be able to baseline and to be able to be confident that you can measure your impact going forward. And so honestly, it's one of the most significant accomplishments my team has done in many years. And I think it'll remain a career highlight, but I'm really proud to be part of this whole process of setting science-based targets that are credible. The other aspect of it is the transparency. And so once you set these goals, you also commit to constantly reevaluating where you are. Do you need to change your goals? Are you in line with the current science? Because science changes. And so there's a dynamic aspect to it as well. So you don't just set the goals and step back and wait till 2050 occurs, but you're constantly reassessing yourself in line with the latest science. And I think that really adds a lot of meaning, and it helps ensure that we're actually supporting this common goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees.
Right. Just to pick up one thing you said there in terms of data, Lenovo presumably is quite well positioned in terms of building systems to acquire and process, analyze data. But how hard is that when you cast that net across your entire supply chain and you're trying to understand what's happening outside of your own walls from beginning to end? What has Lenovo been able to do in that sense to say, look, actually, it's not just us, but we're going to need data from a much wider array of sources. What can you tell us about that journey?
Well, it's hugely complicated. You're absolutely right. And it's actually one of the biggest challenges I think we face. And it's not just climate related when you think about water and even social impact, just measuring your impact and being able to make sure you're on the right path. It's fundamental, but it's really hard. And so even though we are a technology company and we have a huge manufacturing footprint and we have so much of our data is our own, it's still tremendously complicated because when we set these systems up 10, 20 years ago, it wasn't first and foremost with climate and energy in mind. Oftentimes these systems were designed to do other things, and we're just pulling the data we need from existing systems. And in the end, it oftentimes comes down to pulling data from a variety of different systems that weren't necessarily designed to support climate targets and having a team of experts that are able to do the calculations using that data and figure out what our impact is. And that, I'm just talking about our own data. That's hugely complicated. So then you blow that up to your value chain, and in some areas it is really complex. And so certainly the supply chain is one of the areas where it is most complex. And we know that we have a huge footprint. We have global manufacturing, so we have suppliers that are located all around the world. And some of them are huge global players that have been tracking this stuff for many years. They're very sophisticated, but that's not everybody. And we recognize that there are others that are at a different point in their maturity curve, but that there's a lot that we can do to help bring them up with us on this journey. And so later this month, we have it regularly, but later this month, we happen to have one of our supplier ESG education days. We do this quite frequently where we give suppliers an opportunity to learn from us as a global company, because some of our suppliers are quite local, and to understand what we're asking for, what resources are available. So things like the SBTI process, things like the Carbon Disclosure Project, which is not called that anymore, but CDP, and some of these other big global disclosure platforms where suppliers need to have good data in order to participate. And so we can help educate and help make them aware, bring in experts from these different organizations and really encourage them to go down that path. But one of the things that we try to communicate is that this will help you access other global customers as well. So this isn't something you're just doing for us. This is something that you're doing for your own longevity and success as a company, and being able to market yourself as having a CDP response or as having verified climate data or using the SBTI standards. That's something that can open the doors to a much bigger market to some of these suppliers. And then certainly, of course, as I mentioned earlier, there are some of our suppliers who are real leaders in this already. And so there's just a blend, and having to work with that variety of maturity it's really labor intensive. And so we do a lot of education, we do a lot of training and partnering with our suppliers. One of the things I'll mention that we're, of course, we're a supplier to others. So we have our own role in the supply chain as well. And one of the challenges that we see is when you get a lot of different unique requirements. So custom reporting for one customer that's different from the reporting that another customer asks for. In the end, it's all related to climate or water. But if it's in slightly different flavors and slightly different cuts, it drives a ton of work and maybe not a whole lot of real positive impact. And so we're big proponents of standardization, whether it's things like the SBTI, where it's a standard process, or standard disclosures. So things like the CDP platform, which I already mentioned, that allows for reporting on water and climate and energy. But even things like standardized reporting for ESG reports. So we use the GRI standard as a reference for our report. And so having that data that everybody can sort of agree on is important. And it really helps frees our teams up to focus on what's important, which is driving progress rather than necessarily slicing and dicing data in different ways.
Right. So in terms of that standardized reporting, or I guess another way of phrasing that is a misalignment of data, adding overheads onto the process of doing this, which is the last thing you want if you're trying to act with some flavor of urgency. How important is that a challenge that actually you think maybe across industries? How significant a challenge is that right now? And do you think there's enough awareness of it?
I think it's a challenge. I think that we've made a tremendous amount of progress to address it, but there's just a ton of data that's out there. And so different industries and different organizations may have different goals that they want their suppliers to report against. And so coming to some sort of agreement on what's the standard way to report this, and then you can manipulate it and translate it into your own goals is really important. It's something that there's been a lot of focus on, though, and one of the groups that I'll highlight, I think that's doing really important work, is RBA, which is the Responsible Business Alliance. And so they provide reporting platforms for their members. And one of the reasons, much like CDP and the SBTI, one of the reasons why I think their work is important is because they span multiple industries. So it doesn't help if we're all just talking in our trade associations about our own industry. I mean, it helps, but it doesn't solve the whole problem. And so having these fora where we can get together across industries and learn from each other and create common reporting platforms is really important, because our customers may not be in our own industry. In many cases, in almost all cases, they're not necessarily in our industry. They might be coming from automotive or consumer goods, or you name it. And so working together on these different paradigms is hugely important across industries.
Absolutely. Now, the other thing that we can read a lot about in terms of Lenovo, especially if we're considering its smarter technology for all umbrella statement, is it's not just about the environment. There's other things, inclusivity, and bridging the digital divide, I guess, for want of a better phrase, is something that Lenovo is quite serious about as well. What can you tell us about that? I mean, I've read a bit about it, and I know that there's all sorts of things going on there. So if, I'd hate for you to think that you're going to have to list them all, because we'll be here all afternoon. There's philanthropic adventures coming out of every doorway, it would appear. But how important a slice of the pie is that in combination with the environmental objectives? And often it's tempting to put them into two different buckets, but I think it's often sensible to say, actually, no. In the end, we're talking about people. So, I mean, how do you view that as part of your mission?
Yeah, so I think you hit upon, all of this comes down to people in the end, and what sort of impact we have on people, whether they're our customers and supporting them and their journeys and their goals. And that could be from a climate perspective, but it could also be from working with diverse companies that have diversity and inclusion. So I think that it's all part of the value proposition, whether it's So environmental, social, and then also, of course, the G, being a well-governed company and being there for the long haul. And it's part of our value proposition, not just to our customers who want to do good business with a company that's doing the right thing and that has good controls in place, but it's also part of our value proposition to our people. So our own people, our employees who want to work for a company that they feel aligns with their values. And so a lot of it could be environmental, but there's a tremendous amount of it that's social too, wanting to have a sense of purpose, whether it's through our community engagement, the support we give to employees to volunteer, the support we give through dollars and donations of equipment. I think that's a huge group that values our social impact as well. And then, of course, investors. And so we have conversations with investors frequently, and they're very interested in not just the environmental, which of course is a big area of interest to them, but also governance topics, whether it's how we manage our supply chain, and then social issues like our diversity and inclusion goals. So all of that is hugely important. And I want to highlight on the social side specifically, we focus on ourselves, so the diversity of our population, the diversity of our executives, but we're also focused on our customers and the making sure that our products are designed in a way that they can be used by diverse populations. And so we do have a product diversity office that vets our products to make sure we're not building bias into our systems. So that could be a really easy to visualize example would be if we're doing like a headset. Does it work with different size faces? Does it work with different head coverings, hairstyles, that sort of thing? And so, but we do that not just for accessories, but for really all our products to make sure that not just our population, but our products also reflect the diversity of the world.
Absolutely. And so to dig in on diversity a little bit more, it's important if you take the word sustainability and apply it in a much more general sense than just the environment. One argument is that you're not going to be a sustainable company for very long unless you figure out the diversity thing, because you're excluding talent. Ultimately, it's just a silly thing to do, as well as being the wrong thing to do morally. But obviously I'm speaking to someone who's a senior leader in a technology company who's female. And so I'm interested in actually your own journey. You've been focused on the things we've been talking about for a long time as far as your LinkedIn profile tells me. But could you take us back to the beginning? Was it always your personal intention to end up in this place?
Yes, it was. Yeah, so I'm really fortunate that I actually knew what I wanted to do and I was able to go to school for it. And so my academic background is related to environmental science and environmental management. But then my first job out of school was with IBM. And so there's some corporate history between IBM and Lenovo as well. But I worked for IBM in this area. At that time, it was really focused on corporate environmental and specifically product environmental design. And then I had the good fortune of working in another industry, which was academia, and I worked for MIT for a number of years, and then came to Lenovo and joined many of my colleagues that had been at IBM in the past who had gone over to Lenovo when Lenovo acquired parts of IBM's business and became a global company. And so my whole career has been in this area. It's also been in technology-related industries and organizations. And so I think, to your point, diversity is hugely important. And so I have worked for a number of great organizations that have really had a strong focus on that. And I think one of the things that is really important when we talk about diversity is that we are measuring ourselves. And so that's something that we have long-term KPIs around. Female representation in our executive ranks, as well as U.S. Underrepresented minorities in our executive ranks. And so that's something that we're measuring ourselves against. And in fact, we're actually reporting to each of our senior leaders their progress towards our diversity and our climate change and our governance goals. And that's something that we're doing on a regular basis. And it seems so obvious, but I think that the measurement piece, the setting targets, the making it public is hugely important, because people want to know about that. And this goes back to those same stakeholders that I mentioned earlier, our customers, our employees and potential employees, and our investors. But more importantly, it's just really critical to know exactly where you stand. And so for all of our goals, including diversity and inclusion, it's not necessarily a linear path, but you have to see where you are in order to be able to see where you're going.
Absolutely, and I think it's just occurred to me that the day that we are having this conversation is Ada Lovelace Day. I don't know who invented Ada Lovelace Day, but it's today anyway, apparently. Tuesday, the 10th of October, which makes this kind of relevant, I suppose. Ada Lovelace, for anyone who doesn't know, is a famous mathematician, daughter of poet Lord Byron, but who worked with Charles Babbage on what is widely thought of as being the first computer. Babbage thought it was a machine that could do maths. Ada Lovelace was the very first person probably in the world to think, well, hang on, if you can do maths with a machine, that means we can make music. That means we can potentially have it write words or do clever things. She imagined a computer. Babbage was rather more basic. He just thought, well, I can do calculations on this thing. So in that sense, how important would you say, not just Lenovo's, but everybody's focus on making sure that historically somewhat restricted areas of industry for not just women, but other minority groups as well, but let's say it's about the Ada Lovelaces of the world, to achieving some of the goals that we've already talked about in terms of environmental. These are bold, ambitious targets that we all need to make sure people reach. How important is carrying a diverse workforce into that? And then a secondary question to that is, how important is leadership from the very top in actually being able to achieve some of those things?
Yeah, so it's an excellent question. And I think the way I think about it is, so there's the obvious fact that having diversity brings diversity of thought, brings diversity of perspective and diversity of backgrounds, and it helps you get more creativity and innovation to be able to pull from to solve some of these problems. And I think that when we were talking about some of these challenges that we have today, things like climate change and biodiversity and all sorts of different challenges that we're facing just as society, but also as global organizations, they're huge. And it takes insights and perspectives from all parts of an organization and from all different backgrounds in order to be able to get the perspective and the potential innovation that we need in order to make progress. And so it makes no sense to try to limit that to only certain geographies or only certain types of people. We really need input from everybody and diversity of perspectives. So one of the things that I keep telling my teams and others is that we really need to take a step back and rethink how we do everything. So when we're thinking about getting to net zero by 2050, certainly there are going to be these huge changes that occur that impact the whole economy, and those will take us part of the way there. But in addition to that, there are all these little things that we need to change the way we think about our work, the way we think about our products, the way we think about how we do business. And all these little changes that, in this context, I'm talking about climate change, but all these little changes add up. So whether it's a redesign of our product, how we ship our product, how we package it, where we make it, how we make it. And those ideas can't come from one type of person or one type of discipline. We really need the insights from all across the company, all sorts of different people, and all across the world in order to tackle these huge challenges. And to your point about leadership, it's hugely important that people understand this isn't window dressing, that this is something that the company is really committed to doing. It's important because that helps people bring their best ideas forward. It helps people want to work for us and be part of the solution. And I've been very fortunate, I think, working for a big global company. We have the perspective that this is truly a global challenge. This is something that we need to all come together to address. It's not something we can do in isolation. We need to collaborate not just with our suppliers, but also our customers. They have a huge impact, and our products have a huge impact on their goals. And it's not something that we can do just from one part of the world or a couple parts of the world. It really has to be something that we do across the world together. And so I think having a leadership position, both within our company, clear direction from our leaders that this is important, this is something that we've committed to, and we're going to do it. But also having a leadership position within our industry or within wherever we may have a strong geographic presence, and really showing others that this is not just the right way to do it from a citizenship perspective, but from a business perspective as well.
Awesome. And just to I suppose round off our little conversation here, you do have the advantage of being in a significant and highly influential organization with, relatively speaking, lots of resources to be able to devote on these things. If, however, you're a much smaller enterprise, maybe you're a tiny little piece of the Lenovo supply chain somewhere, but you're a much smaller organization, what would your top tips for them be, I guess, which is to say, look, if you were going to pick one or two things that you could do as an organization to convince your body of people to start thinking in the right direction and making some goals and making some changes, what would they be?
So it's true that we're a huge global company with a lot of resources, but it's still never enough. And so this advice that I would give to a small company is the same advice that I give to myself and my team. And the first thing is that we need to figure out what's important. And so in the ESG world, it's materiality, but in lay person's terms, what's really important? What's important to your long-term success as an individual, as an organization, and as a company. And you look to what your customers think is important, what your employees, investors, you have to look at a bunch of different viewpoints. But in the end, it's up to you to figure out where can you really make a difference? What are the biggest risks you need to address? But what are also the biggest opportunities? And so prioritizing is a big theme of mine, because ESG is so broad, and we really just need to be able to focus on recognizing what's important and then focusing our work and our efforts on making a difference in those areas. And then this is sort of the third, but maybe the first two were kind of 1A and 1B. So the last one would be measuring yourself. So you figure out what's important, you focus your efforts on that, and then you have to measure to make sure you're actually having an impact. Because if you're not, either it's not really important or you're not doing it right. And so you have to be able to know what your impact is through data and actually measuring your progress. So that would be what I would recommend to an organization of any size.
Brilliant. Well, I hope that they're all listening. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us. Can I extend an invitation to perhaps join us for another conversation around this time next year when we can find out how Lenovo is getting on 1 year from now? Maybe there'll be some other reports from some other companies that we could have a look at as well. But presumably the journey continues and there's no let up in that ambition. Anyone who's interested in listening to this and reading a bit more, for we will be writing things as well, please come to techforgood.net. And until next time, see you later.
Thanks.